Tonight's speaker is no stranger to tragedy. Well, he has been a Derby County supporter for much of his life. And he tells me he also likes to live dangerously, which is why he and his wife live beside the River Thames near Oxford and spend most of their free time on flood alert. As an avid war gamer and model maker in his own right, it also seems that tonight's speaker had the dream job when he was working for Warhammer. But now in semi-retirement, he swapped his imperial allegiance for a more sedate existence as a volunteer working in Oxford's Bodleian Library. When the University of Buckingham introduced its innovative MA in Military History by Research programme in 2009, tonight's speaker was one of the original cohort. But even before he had completed the course, his mind was already turning to thoughts of a PhD. And in 2022, the results of that PhD thesis were published by Helion under the title of Ham and Jam, 6th Airborne Division in Normandy, Generating Combat Effectiveness, November 1942 to September 1944. Bit of a mouthful, that. It was a book that would earn our author our Society's award of the Templar First Book Prize for 2022. And tonight he's going to give us a flavour of this book in his analysis of British airborne operations in the Second World War, particularly in regard to the 6th Airborne Division. So with no further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Andy Wheale. Andy, take it away.
Thank you very much, Dudley. Well, good evening, everybody. I'll just get my slides up and we shall make a start. So hopefully you can see that. Yes, my talk this evening is about 6th Airborne Division in Normandy. Go to it. That was Windy Gale's divisional motto. But also starting off by setting them in their context of British airborne operations and the formation of British Airborne Forces, and also the wider context of airborne assault warfare in the Second World War. So I'm going to be quite ambitious this evening, so I've got quite a few things to talk about. So first of all, after this introduction, we're going to talk a little bit about the development of airborne assault warfare during the Second World War and Britain's decision to form airborne forces. That will lead on to a brief discussion of the strengths and weaknesses of airborne forces before we then turn to Richard Nelson Gale himself, Windy Gale. Then we're going to talk about manpower, recruitment, volunteer and conversion models, and quickly look at the question of, did British Second World War airborne and commando units take the cream of the infantry? Then we're going to talk about leadership, the brigade and battalion commander selection criteria, the Corps' wider leadership and identity, aircraft resources, that very painful subject for much of the war. And then we're going to turn sharply into what was awaiting 6th Airborne Division in Normandy with a waiting enemy, the fixed fortifications and the possible mechanised response. Then we're going to look at 6th Airborne Division in the wider Neptune plan, what was expected. And then we're going to follow them into action with operations Dead Stick, Tonga and Mallard. Then look at the crisis which occurred really between the 10th and the 12th of June, before we look at the time they spent holding the line before the breakout and the advance to the Seine, and then a bit of analysis at the end. I've got you a little handout to look at, which I shall sort of mention when you need to look at it. But without further ado, we'll get going. So just as a bit more of an introduction into me and my work and my book, I was very ambitious when I decided to do my doctorate, my DPhil. I sort of initially was thinking about doing a doctorate based on the characteristics of the elite regiments of the British Army. And the date range initially was 1815 to 1945. And that would have included everything, light infantry, airborne commandos, guards, Highlanders. And I received very, very positive encouragement at the start of that, but I very rapidly realised that was going to require such a tremendous amount of research that I would never get the focus needed to get a decent doctoral study out of it. So eventually it slowly boiled down to commandos and airborne forces in World War II, and then finally just settling on 6th Airborne Division in Normandy and its preparation for that campaign. And again, I think it's one of those situations where we've all seen the film The Longest Day, and like it all goes swimmingly well. and Piper Millen leads the commandos over the bridge, and that's the end of that. But how did they actually achieve the results they achieved? And then I was fortunate enough to turn my doctorate into a book, Ham and Jam, and here we are now giving this talk. The themes that I'm going to talk about are innovation, leadership, and training, which I think were key, which came out from my doctoral research. But that's kind of how we got here. So moving on. Obviously, this famous quote from John Howard from the Pegasus Diaries. It was just 10 minutes after we had landed, Tappenden began sending out the success signal, Ham for the canal bridge and Jam for the river bridge. We were hoping that this message would be picked up by Brigadier Poet, who had a wireless set on our net, having dropped with a special stick of Pathfinder paratroopers ahead of the main force at about the same time as we landed. Tappenden continued to send out the message with monotonous regularity, positioned alongside me. And I will remember his voice repeating over and over again, hello, Fordog, Ham and Jam, Ham and Jam. I'm certain I heard Tappenden eventually say, Ham and Bloody Jam. So obviously that's where we got to with the origins of the book title. So moving on, it's worth discussing the context of the formation of British Airborne Forces in the Second World War. Kind of my study in terms of a timeline starts really in 1936 when General Archibald Wavell witnessed the Soviet airborne exercises where 1,500 paratroopers were dropped. Wavell was there really to look at the mechanized forces that the Soviets were fielding and their tank development. So he wasn't that interested in the airborne troops that were available. Then moving on quickly, the Germans obviously took it very seriously. Kurt Student witnessed some of these Russian exercises and they rapidly formed their own airborne forces. And then, as I'm sure you're very well aware, the operations that took place in the very start of the Second World War in 1940, the Germans very successfully seized the airfields of Aalborg, Fornebu and Sola in their invasions of Denmark and Norway. And then the real crowning jewel for 1940 was when they seized the fortress of Ebenemael with 414 airborne troops. It was a task which in 1914 had taken 60,000 men, 11 days and 5,000 casualties. But they managed to seize that fort and capture 2 bridges, opening the way for the German advance, which was a spectacular result. Following on from that, obviously, Churchill made his statement in July 1940, calling for a force of around 5,000 paratroopers. Now, this is a problem that caused a variety of issues. 5,000 was a strange number as far as the army was concerned. Was that a large brigade, some sort of light division, a little infantry division? And that caused some consternation from the outset, this sort of vague 5,000 number. But from the outset, 11 SAS was formed by converting a commando unit and filled out with volunteers. So that's the context really in terms of like airborne forces. And looking at Crete, which obviously was like the great success story of German airborne forces in the Second World War, it was, even regardless of the British having Enigma Ultra intelligence warning and the fact that there were 25,000 Anzac troops on Crete, as well as a tremendous number of other forces, the German airborne forces, supported by amphibious landings and further German mountain troops flown in, were able to conquer the island, which was a massive shock. And that line there, Crete, the terrifying cloud, if we go back one slide, the terrifying cloud, that was from a air operations report prepared in the immediate aftermath of the operation. And that described the RAF ground personnel witnessing the parachutes as they opened above them, the terrifying cloud. So moving on, looking at the original operations, and also looking further along the line to Sicily, the Allied operations in Sicily, we can start to see, before 6th Airborne Division went into operation in Normandy, the strengths and weaknesses of airborne forces in the Second World War. So in a minute, I'm going to ask you to have a look at your effectiveness chart, the flow chart, which is your first handout. We'll look at that in a moment. But these are the characteristics of airborne forces. So first of all, obviously, great strategic maneuverability. Being flown by 2- and 4-engined aircraft means you've got tremendous range. And that augments the second characteristic, which is shock and surprise effect. Jim Storr did some amazing work on the shock surprise effect, which kind of boils down to a command paralysis, and also a tensional blink, which is actually the appearance of enemy troops within your midst that causes this pause, which obviously the enemy airborne troops could take advantage of. Then obviously the next important element for airborne forces, which can be a great strength or a weakness, is the importance of intelligence. The Germans were ill-informed as to the amount of Allied forces that were available on Crete, and they suffered accordingly. Whereas, I mean, Windy Gale was very fortunate in that the intelligence available for Normandy was very good. The next characteristic of airborne forces is a light scale of equipment. Things arriving by parachute or glider necessarily means you can't take heavy artillery or armoured fighting vehicles in great numbers with you. You can only take light vehicles or fairly light field artillery at the very most. And then finally, the last characteristic of airborne forces is the need for the drop and landing zones, the DZ and the LZ, to be close to the objectives. If that's not available, then there's an issue with defending those DZs and LZs, as well as trying to deal with an objective, which kind of doubles the task. So all those things are the strengths and weaknesses of airborne forces in the Second World War. So moving on, the great champion of World War II British airborne forces, in my opinion, was Alan Brooke himself. And as chief of Home Command, he organised Exercise Victory in February 1941, which was a general, enormous defensive exercise using all forces against, imagining German amphibious assaults everywhere, all the way from Scotland down to Devon. And it included no less than 15 imaginary German parachute regiments in this whole scenario, because he took airborne forces very seriously. What happened in Crete led to a very important document a bit later on, which was the August 1941 military training pamphlet number 50, Defence Against Airborne Forces, which came out only in a few months and included key characteristics in terms of how to resist an airborne assault. Then obviously moving on with Biting, Husky and Operation Biting, the raid to seize the German radar, and then with the operations supporting Husky, Fustian and Ladbroke, other key issues were seen. And from that, moving on, we can see a theoretical basis developing for the operations of airborne forces by the British in World War II, which really the most pertinent, the May 1943 Airborne Operations pamphlet is very theoretical, and I think is a very sort of glass half full document, assuming great cooperation between Army and RAF forces. Whereas I think the October 43 memorandum, which is an employment of airborne forces paper, is far more realistic post Fustian and Ladbroke and gives clear directions. So if you go to your first handout, if you go to the flowchart, 1939-1945 Airborne Operations Success and Failure Process Diagram, bit long-winded, sorry about that. But if you actually look at the chart in front of you and you look down the left-hand side, there's the airborne force, and down the right-hand side is the defending force. And there's a pre-operation, there's various elements of important pre-operation, obviously regarding appreciation of enemy forces, intelligence, rehearsal with air forces, which is key for the airborne force, and effective training. And then going through just the process, really, this is from all my analysis of operations leading up to Normandy, and the doctrinal documents that I went through when I did all my primary research. There's obviously a shock surprise of landing phase, and then really the situation can go one of two ways. And the documents are sort of listed in smaller print as we move through them. For the defender, if number 50 pamphlet is followed positively, speed of recovery from shock, quickly interpret the airborne threat. Whereas on the airborne side, speed of cohesive recovery post-landing, momentum into the attack, then there's a decisive battle, with various other factors feeding in: concentration to attack, leadership, simple plans for the airborne forces. For the defending forces, reaction of anti-airborne drills, mobile reinforcements, firepower defences, and then the success scenarios at the bottom of the page. But I think it's interesting to sort of set that down. I kind of set that down to clarify my own thinking, and I thought I'd share that with you. And it's an example of some of the charts and diagrams that I've got in the book to sort of illustrate where my research ended up. So now a little bit about Windy Gale and his background. He had a very interesting pre-Second World War career, in that he joined the Worcestershire Regiment from Sandhurst, But if you read his general memoir, I think he feels he was kind of tricked into joining the machine gun corps. He sort of volunteered to go for an experimental course, and actually, when he arrived there, he found out that he'd actually been signed up for the MGC. He was exposed to some sort of key Jedwine, Solly Flood, some key command personalities at 55 and 42 Division, and he disliked aloof red tabs. That's a quote from Gale. He always wanted to be a soldier. And then moving through, he spent some time in India on the northwest frontier. Then he went back to the Worcester Regiment, did staff college. He's involved in the military training directorate, Simla. And then, interestingly, in 1936, he was actually with the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry in 2nd Division with Wavell when he did actually go and see those airborne exercises in Russia. And I do wonder whether they actually chatted about that, about what Wavell saw. And then 37, 38, he was working on War Office pamphlets. 38, 39, the War Plan. And obviously, when things didn't work out so favourably in 1940, he was with the 2nd, 5th Leicesters, a TA battalion in command. But through his career, he'd encountered Brooke at various times, and Brooke was impressed with Gale. So he's fortunate to become the first commander of 1st Parachute Brigade in September 41. So moving forward, the Army Air Corps wider leadership, it's worth sort of briefly touching on that. Obviously, a key personality in all of British Army Air Corps history, narrative, formation is Major General Frederick Boy Browning. And Browning's personal ambition, I think, was a key element in driving the organisational growth of Airborne Forces. As Airborne Forces grew, Browning basically got promoted from Major General to Lieutenant General as it became a corps. And he was really the ultimate guardsman in many ways, and he was he was networked in society and the rest of the army. And the wider airborne initial leadership of the Airborne Division, as it was before it became 1st British Airborne Division, was the Dungeon Party, which was based in the Air Ministry Story Gate building. So obviously they referred to that as the Dungeon, and that had a very strong guards presence within it as well. At the same time, in late 1941, that the Airborne Division was formed with 31st Independent Brigade Group, as well as 1st Parachute Brigade under Gale. The Army Air Corps itself was formed, obviously with its accompanying, eventually maroon berets and distinctive badges, the Pegasus badge, and that included the SAS, the Glider Pilot Regiment, and the Airborne Division itself. So quite a distinct culture was formed of the Army Air Corps from Browning. And in the book, I make reference to some training documents where he emphasises strong presentation, fitness above all, and sort of self-discipline. And he's certainly a very interesting character, something of a contrast to Gale, I think, in many ways, but obviously a strong influence. So 6th Airborne Division was formed in May 1943. There'd been a considerable issue going back to April 42, which I'll touch on because it involved Brooke and Browning. In April 1942, Brooke had complained bitterly about the paucity of aircraft resources for Airborne Forces development, and he'd sent this memorandum straight to Churchill, which caused a lot of problems, and Alan Brooke wasn't very happy about that. And tension built. There was an airborne element in the Operation Rutter plan, which would ultimately become Jubilee, the raid on Dieppe, which was dropped, although Paget was a very strong supporter of it, because the operational aircraft available for Airborne Forces at that point were just so weak. There's just a few squadrons of Whitleys, and it was, and we'll talk about airborne aircraft resources in a minute or two, but it was so weak. And obviously, at the same time, the RAF had their own agenda in terms of the fact they wanted to build up bomber command to such a powerful strike force it could carry the war deep into the heart of Germany, and hopefully, under Bomber Harris's leadership, paralyse the German war effort. And the requirements of Airborne Forces at that point in the war were just far in excess of what the RAF could cope with. So moving forward to November 1942, there was a serious rift between the RAF direction and what the army wanted for its Airborne Forces. And this kind of came to a head with Lord Charwell, Churchill's scientific advisor, complaining about the sheer scale of the glider production programme. The glider production programme used in railway carriage companies essentially to build gliders was far outstripping the aircraft that could possibly tow them, and these gliders were lying around, and a considerable amount of RAF personnel were involved just in their maintenance, just stopping them rotting on the airstrips. And Churwell challenged Churchill that this was just a ridiculous expense, and then essentially it was taken to the committee, and Churchill decided to pause the development of airborne forces. And Brooke was very resistant to any kind of regression of this development, and he actually was quite prepared to just turn 1st Airborne Division into a motorised light division because he thought it was such a great military formation and entity. But this problem was overcome mainly by Brooks championing the idea that there'd been a misunderstanding, that in fact in an air landing brigade rather than 4 battalions there would only be 2, and 31st Brigade had been which became the Air Landing Brigade, was split into 2 battalion brigade entities. With 1st Airborne's commitment in the Mediterranean, with the Parachute Brigade going out to Tunisia, that enabled the Army to form 3rd Parachute Brigade to replace 1st Parachute Brigade as part of the Airborne Division in the autumn of 1942, and that would become the 1st Brigade of 6th Airborne Division. So slowly but surely, 6th Airborne Division came into being, mainly through Brooks' vigorous support in the face of RAF doubts. And that division be formed using the conversion and the volunteer process, which we'll talk about in a minute or two. So here we are then really with non-commissioned rank selection, and these are the models. So initially, volunteers were asked for across the Army as per the Commando Special Service Forces, and that enabled 1st Parachute Brigade and then later 2nd Parachute Brigade to be formed, which comprised initially of 4 battalions. And 2nd Parachute Brigade was filled out with using the conversion model, converting 7 Camerons and 10 Royal Welsh Fusiliers directly into 5th and 6th battalions of the Parachute Regiment. And it's interesting to challenge the idea that possibly did Airborne and Commando Forces take all the best infantrymen and all the best soldiers out of the rest of the Army. I've got a chart in the back of the book that shows that Airborne and Commando Forces entirely at the time of D-Day, from the records I found at Kew, only formed 1.32% of the entire Army and only 5% of the infantry. And also there was a Airborne Policy Memorandum for the 20th of August 1941, which limited the number of volunteers which could be taken at one time from 1 unit to just 10. And I have an analysis in the book that shows that if you look at the battalion structures, 1942 and 1944, if you basically took the warrant officers and the senior sergeants from a typical battalion, you would get nowhere near taking all the best soldiers out of a battalion, because all the NCO warrant officer ranks, there's far in excess of 10. So even if you took the best guys out of every battalion that approached you with volunteers, you'd never do them that great a deal of harm. So the 1st Brigade, the 1st Brigade of the 6th Airborne Division was coalesced in 223rd Brigade in October 1942, and this was a concentration of 10th Somerset, 13th Warwick and 10th Essex, who became 7, 8 and 9 battalions respectively. And on November the 5th, 1942, that became 3rd Parachute Brigade. Later, the 5th Parachute Brigade had formed with the 1st Canadian Battalion, and also the conversion of 10 Green Arrows to 12th Para and 2nd 4th Prince of Wales Volunteers to the 13th Battalion. I think one thing that is worth pointing out that from my book, the motivation of men to join Airborne and Commando Forces, which I went through all the files of Airborne and Commando personnel at the Second World War Experience Centre in Yorkshire, is the main motivation was that they were browned off and they wanted to see action. So I'm sure that, like many good aggressive soldiers, were taken up, but I don't think to the absolute detriment of the infantry in time for D-Day. One thing that should be pointed out is that Airborne Forces certainly went through and ransacked the 70th series battalions, the young soldier battalions. And I've got a study in the book showing how 8 battalion, the Midlands parachute regiment took so many guys from Warwick and Leicester young soldier battalions, and they certainly went through and took a lot of the aggressive young soldiers from the General Service Corps when that was fully up and running. So moving on quickly to leadership, brigade and battalion commander selection criteria. It's interesting to see there's 5 characteristics that seem to come up time and time again when you spot these men who've been selected to be commanding officers and company commanders indeed for these parachute and air landing battalions. First of all, the criteria is being an airborne pioneer and a volunteer. And you can see that in people like James Hill, for example, and Luard, who commanded 13th Battalion, but then also regulars. 6 out of 7 commanding officers are replaced by regular officers of the new battalions. And then the next thing is that a strange slang word from both World Wars, the idea of the thruster, somebody who's very keen and aggressive. And possibly a classic example of that is actually the chap who ended up being the commanding officer of 6th Airborne's Artillery, 53rd Air Landing Regiment, the Worcestershire Yeomanry, Tony Teacher, who commanded the same regiment on Exercise Spartan, which was a great home command operation in Yorkshire, where he actually massacred the Guards Armour Division using his own regiment as well as anti-aircraft formations, fighting in a attack defence scenario, and that was quite noticeable. The Guards actually questioned the refereeing, but Tony Teacher had used his forces very aggressively. So they're the characteristics that I identified with the selection of battalion and brigade commanders. So quickly moving on, looking at aircraft and glider resources. As I say, this led to the rift with the RAF in November 1942. And there's questions that we have to ask with all the aircraft used by British Airborne Forces in the Second World War is about cost and how fit for purpose they were. And even by the summer of 1943, 38 Group was still incapable of carrying a complete parachute brigade into action. And the aircraft that they'd been given were poor, I feel. The Whitley bomber could carry 10 paratroopers. It was basically an ancient bomber. And for a long time, as far as the formation of Airborne Forces was concerned, all through 1942, that's all they had. And when it actually got through to D-Day itself, the RAF was only capable of carrying 2/3 of Windy Gale's division into action in Normandy. Obviously, it being split between Operations Tonga and later in the day of 6th of June, Operation Mallard. And even then, some elements still had to arrive by sea. I go through various things in the book discussing the possibility of the York transport plane, the transport version of the Lancaster, if that could have been used, because basically all our problems were solved at the end of 1943 when the Americans issued a group equipment of over 500 C-47 DC-3 Dakota aircraft, which enabled the rapid formation of 46 Group, which was very rapidly trained from converted coastal command squadrons, and was essentially signed off just in time for final D-Day training. But all through that was an issue in terms of the context of British Airborne Forces, is a poverty of aircraft resources. So it's worth touching on the training ethos of Windy Gale and of the Army Airborne Corps itself. Emphasis on aggression, because there'd be no fallback position once Airborne Forces were launched into action. Self-reliance, as above. Infantry fighting, and then obviously there was role-specific training with pre-parachute to Hardwick Hall, which was extremely tough, toughening the troops up ready for parachute training, the further stage of role-specific training. Something that Gale concentrated on in the preparation for D-Day, 3 things particularly. What he called the anti-tank hedgehog. Essentially, Gale was focused on 2 key tasks when his division went into action in Normandy. And that was going to be fighting involving infantry trying to repair or seize bridges, and also resisting German mechanized forces. So that fed through to his plans for the division for D-Day, which we'll touch on in a minute. But all of the training that Gale practiced and his leadership cadre practiced was very relevant. It was toughening, it was self-reliance, it was aggression, it was specific relevant tasks. Something else that is worth touching on as a theme of my thesis, which helped 6th Airborne Division generate its combat effectiveness, was innovation. And although the aircraft situation, on which I've just discussed, was not great, the aircraft were adapted. The Albemarle bomber, the Whitley bomber, the Halifax, the Sterling, they were all adopted and adapted for airborne forces. So they did have some planes, even if they weren't as good as they should have been. Something else that Norris, the Commander Royal Artillery for the division, was very strong on was co-opting the firepower of nearby conventional Royal Forces, forward observation officers for the Royal Navy and forward observation officers for Royal Artillery Forces, particularly, as it turned out, 51st Highland and 3rd Division once they were in action. One unfortunate situation with that is that very late in the day, just before D-Day, there were some FOOs from 3rd Division who were given parachute training, and they did drop into action, but virtually all of them were lost, scattered, which I think was a waste, because obviously they weren't as skilled as they might have been in terms of that environment. And also another important innovation was actual battle grouping. Effective grouping, you can see it twice, because effectively Operation Dead Stick, Pine Coffin was in charge of Operation Dead Stick, and D Company Ox and Bucks Light Infantry was part of 7 Para. 7 Para's briefing was that if D Company Ox and Bucks under John Howard were wiped out, or indeed the bridges were destroyed, 7 Parachute Battalion had the timber, rope and bits and pieces to rebuild those bridges. And then later, you'll see it when we'll discuss this in a minute, is the Breville Composite Assault Force on the 12th of June, where Gale tied together various units into a combat group to do a job. So I'm sure the audience is familiar with D-Day. Obviously, we've just had the 80th anniversary, but it's worth touching briefly on 6th Airborne and the Neptune plan. 6th Airborne was intended to secure the eastern side of the landings effectively. The outlook of senior commanders was quite varied. Lee Mallory was very concerned that the airborne forces would suffer terrific, almost 100% casualties. Omar Bradley was quite prepared for the US airborne forces to take in excess of 75% casualties, as long as the amphibious troops got ashore. Miles Dempsey had a very interesting view, which I explore in the book. It was very much glass half full as far as airborne troops were concerned. And I think he'd seen the very positive results that had been achieved in Sicily. He didn't see the issues. He didn't really see sort of the scattering drawbacks. He was just aware of advances facilitated by airborne troops. And at the same time, he'd seen the struggle for river crossings of the Rapido, the Garigliano and the Gari River crossings in Italy, and also the stalemate that had happened at Anzio where no airborne forces had been used. So Miles Dempsey very much saw the air as the open flank above the enemy, and also as a way of very rapidly reinforcing the infantry in his amphibious bridgehead. So he's very much a supporter, as was Montgomery, of airborne forces. So the divisional plan, which I'll go through in a minute, looking at a map in your little handout pack, there had to have been a significant alteration to the initial plan, which had involved the whole of the Air Landing Brigade landing around the bridges, and that had to be switched out for 5th Parachute Brigade, the junior brigade of the division, when it became apparent that the pole obstacles had been erected by photographic reconnaissance in April, which was a major shift. But from my studies, it shows that with appreciations, Gale's senior leadership team were able to just switch it out very easily. So Tonga, the operation on the night of the 5th, 6th of June, essentially this fell into 2 halves. There was essentially battalion objectives for the attack and then to fall back into a defensive line behind the Dive River. And then obviously massive reinforcement with the Air Landing Brigade with heavy weapons later in the day. If we look at the enemy dispositions map, you can see where the landing zones were for each of the battalions and what their objectives were. This is a map straight out of the book. Landing zones X and Y by the Caen Canal and the Orne River bridges, Operation Dead Stick, And then the large landing zone, which became the divisional supply zone, DZN, between Breville and Le Marquette, and then 8 para landing down on DZK, and then the Canadians and 9 para landing on DZV near Varaville and Riviere. So, and then all the objectives down the right in the little further bubbles, the bridges across the River Deve, and obviously the objectives around the canal and the Orne River bridges. So they were the objectives. So if we go back, there was a tank killing ground that Gale planned to erect using the additional heavy weapons and anti-tank guns, which the Air Landing Brigade would bring in, which is around St Honorine, Escoville and Chardronnet. Apologies for my French pronunciation. But that's where he anticipated the key mechanised response. He also planned Parker Force, which was going to be under the command of the assistant commander of the Air Landing Brigade, Reggie Parker, which was going to be formed of 6th Airborne Armoured Reconnaissance Regiment with its Tetrarch tanks and carriers, a company of the Devons, and also artillery and Royal Engineer elements. And that he was planning for Parker Force to marauder out of the Airborne bridgehead to menace German reinforcements advancing on the bridgehead of the whole of First Corps, which was quite ambitious, but also in keeping with what Montgomery planned to use the armoured brigades very aggressively in the first few days of the landing. So, in summary, the divisional plan was pretty tight. It was going to include destructive, almost raids in the first stage of Tonga before falling back into a defence line behind the Deve, shielding 5th Parachute Brigade, which would be dug in around Ronville, the divisional HQ. So it's worth talking a little about the waiting enemy, the fixed defences. There were 3 infantry divisions that 6th Airborne Division were going to face on D-Day and in the subsequent few weeks of critical fighting. 716 Division, 711 Division, and particularly 346 Division. In a moment, we'll look again at the map which I've just talked through with you to just look at some of the German company positions, which I took from a map that I found in Freiburg, which is there on bullet point number 4, and that must have been pretty close to D-Day. And analysing that map, because you can actually see that 21st Panzer Division and 716 Division companies are intermingled. And that was a movement that Rommel sort of ordered, certainly sort of probably early May 44. And it's worth looking, if we just go forward again to that map. If you look at this map, the German locations, which are in like the little hatched line, the hatched ovals, if you like, it's all company positions because they were trying to garrison everything effectively. So if you look at Colombelles, where the great tower, industrial towers were near Caen, that's 8th Company 125 Panzer Grenadier Division. Then the 7th Company at Hérouvillette, 5th Company down at Troarn, and the only real concentration in anything approaching battalion strength is 642 Ost Battalion near Horga, and they were lower class troops. James Hill actually said, he actually commented, and it's in the brigade diary for Free Parachute Brigade, that they were almost overwhelmed with 642 prisoners in the day or two after D-Day. A lot of Eastern European conscripts who were very pleased to have been captured by the British. But it shows really that the Germans had tried to sort of garrison everything, and they weren't really able to concentrate fast enough to crush the airborne forces. Looking back at that process chart that I showed you the first handout page, even though these companies, for instance, like 7th Company 125 Panzer Grenadier Division, they were heavily armed. They had half tracks, they had French sort of repurposed half tracks, a lot of machine guns, a lot of mortars. They still weren't able to assemble the head count to really crush the airborne landings. The next element of the waiting enemy is the mechanized forces, obviously, and that really means 21st Panzer Division under Edgar Feuchtinger. 21st Panzer Division had been formed around a core of maybe 3,000 veterans from the original 21st Panzer Division, which had fought in the Africa Corps and been filled out by conscripts and other returning injured personnel. Its regimental commanders were very experienced Eastern Front veterans, Joseph Rauch, Hans von Luck, who'd fought in the desert, Hermann von Oppan-Bronikowski. And it was probably the weakest part of that division, I'd say, actually, was Edgar Feuchtinger himself. He'd been a party apparatchik in the interwar period. He'd been involved in the Nazi Party rallies. He commanded an artillery unit in the 41-42 winter campaign in Russia, where he'd won plaudits for standing his ground, although there's a strong suggestion that he wasn't really able to go anywhere else in the face of the Russians and the cold. And then he'd basically been able to land himself the command of Schneller Group West, which was a mechanized, motorized group based around Paris, using reconditioned French transport and armored vehicles. And that became the core of the new 21st Panzer Division. So in many ways, he kind of defaulted into becoming the commander of this division, also using his connections. But his brigade commanders were very good, I think. And also the final bullet point on that page, it's worth remembering that 12th SS Panzer Division was nearby. And I think with a sharper response from Feutinger and his HQ, and perhaps a sharper response in the early hours of D-Day itself, I think they could have been called into play quite swiftly indeed. So that's worth bearing in mind. And also, looking at the documents which I cover in the book, certainly Windy Gale had very good intelligence on potential armoured forces surrounding him, surrounding where the airborne bridgehead would land, and certainly gave tremendous potential. There's certainly an overestimate of Panther and Tiger tanks in those strength analysis, but he was obviously planning for a difficult situation. But 21st Panzer Division was the strongest opposition for 6th Airborne Division on D-Day itself. So essentially, first day, Operation Tonga, despite terrible scattering issues where only 33% of 3rd Parachute Brigade and around 60% of 5th Parachute Brigade were assembled, effectively all objectives were achieved. And there's a little quote there from the Stephen Ambrose book. So it went well and they fell back into the defensive line. Just moving forward, again, to that map, that's the situation. Obviously, that's effectively the DZ map and the German positions overlaid. And that's the combat that was going on the day of D-Day and the following days afterwards. Operation Mallard took place around 9:30 p.m. On the day of D-Day. 247 gliders swept in, and that had a considerable morale effect on the German defenders and also the British defenders and the Germans who were trying to dislodge them. And something that I picked up, which I put into the book, is that an Enigma report of German signals from Carpignay airfield was sent to Churchill, much to his glee, which showed that there was a considerable panic. And it also played quite a part in Joseph Rauch falling back from Line sur Mer, where he'd managed to advance to the coast with elements of 192 Panzer Grenadier Regiment. So 247, again, it's a situation where airborne forces were succeeding in all sorts of unexpected ways. And Operation Mallard, I think, regardless of all the troops and heavy weapons it brought in, was a tremendous fillip for the British troops who'd landed either by airborne or amphibious means. So it's worth now talking about the second great crisis, which I cover in the book, really, which is obviously that period of fighting between the 10th and the 12th of June around St. Combe Chateau and Breville. Through the 7th to the 9th, 5th Parachute Brigade fought off several assaults attacking across in the direction of Ronville and Drop Zone N. And it's faintly reminiscent of the 1918 award of Windy Gale's MC. He won an MC coordinating the fire of heavy machine guns, which certainly played a big part in 12 and 13 Battalion's defence of Ronville and that DZ. But then as we move forward, the line was coming under tremendous pressure from 346 Division, which had been brought into the line and was now under the command of 81st Army Corps under General de Panzertruppen Adolf Friedrich Kunzen. And the attacks were just increasing, supported by armoured vehicles and artillery, mortars, considerable reports of German reinforcements moving up. And at the same time, 51st Island Division was moving into the bridgehead. And a real crisis came where by the 10th of June, the chateau itself, there were tanks and self-propelled guns blasting directly into it. And then on the 11th of June, 5th Black Watch, their attack was repelled quite seriously under severe rocket, Nebelwerfer and mortar fire. And it took 60 dogs' bodies, which James Hill himself rallied from the HQ of 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion to drive them off. It was an extremely desperate situation. All these battalions were very under strength by this point due to scattering and casualties. 1st Special Service Commando Brigade was in the line to the north, but obviously they were in a similar situation. So if we look at the situation map, which is the last of your handouts, 3rd page, that gives you a situation of 6th Airborne's position at this point. You can see Gale's tank killing ground to the south around St Honorine and Escoville, with continued attacks from 125 Panzer Grenadier Regiment. There's the line of the air landing battalions just to the north of that. 13 Parachute Battalion around the divisional HQ at Ronville, and 6 Armoured Airborne Reconnaissance Regiment supporting 8 Para on the Bois de Bavant, with the German attacks coming in. And it's worth bearing in mind, just to set this time period of the sort of 12th, 13th of June into some context, the entire D-Day battle, it's worth bearing in mind that on the 12th of June, 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division was attacking 101st US Airborne at Carentan. On the 13th of June, 22nd Armoured Brigade got flung out of Villers Bocage by the SS 101st Heavy Tank Battalion. Operation Ball Basket is trying to slow down the advance of the Das Reich Division, marching up from the centre of southern France. So it's scary times in terms of the Allied lodgement, the bridgehead in Normandy. In the book, something I cover is the intelligence reports of 13th, 18th Hussars with their Sherman tanks, which were supporting the 6th Airborne Division at this point. And they actually were picking up rumours, intel, that possibly Rommel himself was going to lead mechanised forces to attack 3 Division to the south. And the big German push that was going on against 6th Airborne Division was a supporting attack to facilitate that. And that's one of those signals. This is actually from the divisional intelligence report of the 13th of June, going through the lineup of enemy formations from Isigny to Caen. And it shows you the difficulty of the situation. More units, the enemy has not stopped bringing new units into our area. 711 Infantry Division may send further reinforcements to 346 instead of sitting back on the east bank of the Dive. And 21st Panzer Division may be withdrawing units from the west of Caen for use east of the Orne. We should soon have further details about this. The enemy may be on the defensive, but it will be a defensive conducted along typical offensive lines with many more counterattacks. So Gale made a very bold command decision to create a composite force to eliminate the small bulge around the village of Breville, which was not so far from where the pressure, the fighting had been at the Chateau St Com, very close by. That photograph is a photograph I took in 2012. That's actually standing with Breville Church behind me, looking in the direction of Sword Beach, and it directly overlooks Drop Zone Z straight down. And the photograph's not that great, but you can actually see Weistram in the distance. So that's the position that Breville occupied. And Gale was very concerned that Breville could be used as a great jumping off point for a big German push straight towards Sword Beach. So he created this composite force, this battle group of 12th Parachute Battalion, which had just been relieved by 4th Special Service Brigade, starting to appear in the bridgehead, D Company 12th Devon and A Squadron 13th, 18th Hussars with their Shermans, supported by massed artillery from 3rd and 51st Divisions of 5 Field and 1 Medium Regiment. The assault was launched under the cover of darkness on the 12th of June. The commander of 12th Parachute Battalion was AP Johnson, was a casualty very early on. Also, 2 brigadiers were injured, Kindersley and Lovett, by a falling short artillery barrage. But Reggie Parker went forward, took command of 12 Battalion, and the assault was a success. Following on, in the days that followed, the rest of 4th Special Service Brigade under Jumbo Lester arrived, and the position was made more secure. But that was a key moment for Gale and 6th Airborne Division, a key battle where they eliminated an opportunity, which that photograph shows, what the Germans could have achieved if they'd captured Breville. They could have really pushed down deep into the bridgehead, but he eliminated that by putting together a force of what he had: leadership, aggression, relevant training, self-reliance, all these themes, innovation, all these themes were present in that attack, and it was a victory. So there were mistakes in terms of Gale's plan. The Homilicar heavy glider loadout can be challenged. virtually all the Tetrarch tanks were brought in by Hamilcar gliders with Bren gun carriers, when really they'd have much more benefited from more 6-pounder and more, particularly 17-pounder anti-tank guns, which have made a real difference. And that combines into the idea really of Parker Force, this idea that they were going to venture out with this sort of composite force of Tetrarch tanks, which were very, very thinly armoured. There's a little photograph of the one there in the slide. Just 2-pounder guns and a machine gun, one company of Devons and some artillery and engineer elements. I mean, they'd have been, I think, quite swiftly chewed up by the armoured vehicles of 21st Panzer Division, and even just the regular German infantry with their own weapons, I think Panzerfaust and stick grenades. But to Gale's credit, he abandoned that idea very early on and just used the 6th Armoured Airborne Reconnaissance Regiment to reinforce 8 para on the Bois de Bavent. Later, the Tetrarchs would be replaced by Cromwell tanks with 75mm guns, which were much more typical and better suited for the environment. So if we move on and we look at the holding of the line, this is quite an interesting order. 2nd Army HQ Ops, June 1944, 1st Corps Operation Instruction Number 3, dated 19th of June. 6th Airborne Division will confine itself to making the general line Les Mesnil, Breville, Salonel absolutely firm. Combined with this task, there will be infiltration and frigging about east of the above line to the maximum degree the resources of the division will allow, but remembering that the security of the firm base is the first consideration. And they certainly made that the first consideration, and the line was completely solid for the rest of the Normandy campaign. They observed Operation Goodwood going in on the 18th of July. Gale had a plan to possibly sweep forward and capture Cabourg if Goodwood really broke through. So he's ready for his own initial little plan to break out of the bridgehead towards the Seine if things had gone well. But by the time of Operation Paddle, the complete breakout advance to the Seine, it says a lot that Gale almost had like a mini corps within 1st Corps, because he was in command not only of 6th Airborne Division, he also had the Princess Irene Dutch Brigade, the Belgian Infantry Brigade, as well as the 1st and 4th Special Service Commando Brigades under his command. So he had a considerable, if quite under strength and lightly armed command holding that side of the bridgehead. So moving forward and wrapping up, after Normandy, 6th Airborne Division advanced to Seine before it was withdrawn. It took part in the Battle of the Bulge. It took part in crossing the Rhine. Operation Varsity, and was being prepared for a move to the Far East by the time the war ended. Richard Gale's career was illustrious after the Second World War. He commanded 1st British Airborne Corps. He became the Director of Military Training, General Officer commanding Northern Army Group of NATO, and finally Deputy Supreme Commander of NATO in Europe. And that was a post that the Americans actually asked for him to do, a request from the Americans, which is quite kudos, really. So I did a chart here. You haven't got this as a handout, but hopefully you can see it. Basically, it gives you an idea of Gale's leadership and how 6th Airborne Division worked, what were the main drivers, continuous training, constant communication, Army Air Corps input, identity, volunteer spirit, standards, role-specific training, toughening, organisational self-actualisation. The Gale effect was one of energising communication, key authority. He was an airborne architect. He was a guru, as well as being a traditional infantry soldier. Simplicity and very careful leader selection. Going on to a task focus, training was relevant. There was some redundancy of force built in, even though there were airborne troops. Considerable use of surprise and shock. Proximity of drop zones to objectives. Simplicity of plans again. And then moving on to output, initiative, cohesion, adaptation, improvisation, resilience and confidence. And that's how they succeeded. That's how 6th Airborne Division achieved its combat effectiveness in the Normandy campaign. I think it says a lot about Gale. Gale was very much something of a chameleon. If you look at the picture that I've got at the start of the presentation, if we go back, there are some images of Gale, which is worth reviewing. That's him outside his HQ in Ranville. He's got his artillery glasses. He's smoking a cigarette. He's generating an image of the experienced First World War soldier for his men, for his young soldiers. And I didn't actually believe this when I first read this, when I was doing my research for the thesis, but I did actually put it into the book, when I revisited it, found it in a few other sources. On the day of D-Day, Gale actually found a white horse, and he was actually riding around the divisional HQ on a white horse, which is extraordinary. And if you saw it in a Hollywood film, I think everybody would think it was quite ridiculous. But he did actually do that. Unfortunately, the horse was killed by enemy, excuse me, enemy shell fire. But I mean, that must have been a great boost and fillip to his soldiers. And there's plenty of photographs of Gale training and inspiring his men before D-Day. So finally, it's worth just to sum up a final analysis of 6th Airborne Division's contribution to victory in Normandy. The eastern flank was secured on D-Day by the Orne Canal Dives buffer zone being created. They blew the bridges on the Dives, and they captured the bridges on the Orne and the Caen Canal. So that area between it became their patch. They held on to that. Enemy reinforcement movement was severely hampered by the capture and destruction of these key bridges. Robert Kershaw estimates 5 to 6 hours diversion time from the eastern side of the bridgehead down to the south near Caen. Conventional Royal Infantry formations released for offensive operations to the south by what they did, holding that side. So 3rd Division, all those other divisions were able to push forward down to the south to fight those key battles that broke the Germans eventually. And whilst I think this is a key element as well, while 6th Airborne Division's losses were heavy, they were not Pyrrhic. The division was rebuilt. And by October 1944, Guy Simmons was wheedling and trying to persuade Brooke to release it for operations in his section with Canadian forces. So there we are. That's the end of my presentation. Hopefully you enjoyed it.
Thanks very much indeed, Andy. That was great. I was interested in the point that you made about Gale stressing the importance of simplicity. And then we get Otway's attack on Merville Battery, which is anything else but simple. Would you like to comment on that?
I think it's interesting, and I think it is a complicated plan. Otway's plan to capture Merville Battery is complicated. There's a lot of moving parts, and me and Dudley have actually already talked about this before. And there is this wonderful interview available on the Imperial War Museum website where Julian Thompson interviewed Alistair Pearson, the commander of 8th Battalion. And Alistair Pearson is quite a critic of Otway and his plan. And Julian Thompson asks Pearson, well, what would you have done then? And Pearson said in his very thick Scottish accent, I'd have diversion, attack the main gate. That's it. I mean, I think at the end of the day, aggression, adaptation, reliance. Otway, I think there's a strong whiff of Aben the Mail perhaps about Otway's plan. I mean, if it had come off, it would have been quite a sight, and it would have been very effective. And it is worth bearing in mind that similar to that picture of I took myself with my back to Breville, the Merville Battery was in the face of the Sword landing beach, and if they'd really got going, it could have caused complete carnage on that beach, even with those dodgy old Czech guns.
Yeah. The other question I wanted to put to you is this whole question of doctrine, and your book majors a lot on the doctrinal sources, but as you and I discussed, doctrine's all well and good if someone actually reads it. Would you like to elaborate on your discussions with Bob Kershaw?
Oh yeah, I was very privileged that somebody I know, an acquaintance of mine, Andy Granger, introduced me to Bob Kershaw, and we actually had a night out in Salisbury after Bob had read my manuscript of Ham and Jam, and he sat there and he did say all this stuff about doctrine. He said, I don't think many of them would have read it, and I think that's a fair comment. I mean, Timothy Harrison Place makes the point in his book about Second World War British Army training that a junior tank commander would have had to have read something in the region of 73 pamphlets before D-Day to be doctrinally up to speed. And there's no way they'd have done that, I'm sure, because they wouldn't have had time to do anything else. And I think that culture, that guards ethos that Browning brought in, standards, you've got people like Speedy Hill, who made everybody speed march and run everywhere, aggression, you've got, these amazing commanding officers. That was much more an ethos And then standing at the top of the pyramid, you've got Gale, who's radiating this machine gun core, crusty World War One. That's the image he presented to his soldiers. If you see him in his pictures when he's talking to his soldiers, he's bareheaded. He's wearing this tatty denizen smock with jodhpurs, with his hands in his pockets, or with a fag on the go. You know, he's radiating confidence. And then there are interesting other pictures where he looks almost like Eisenhower in a fantastic like #1 uniform with tabs. You know. But that's all the ethos. It's all the stuff going on. But it's very interesting. The doctrine stuff's very interesting because it perhaps gives you an idea of how the staff officers are thinking, and it is worth the memorandum, the October 43 memorandum paper post Husky is very kind of candid and grounded, and that's worth checking that out. It's in the reference at Q is in my footnotes, and that is, you know, that's quite sound, I think, you know.
Yeah, Johnny's asked this question: do the Germans take very different lessons away from the Crete operation? I think no further major airborne assaults by the LW during the war. So was Crete a bit of a Pyrrhic victory? The British seemed more dazzled by the coup de main, or did the Allies just have much greater resources, so they're not scared off?
I think I get a lot of it does come down to like what your resource base is like. It's interesting to look at the American airborne, like the American airborne resources are terrific. They form a tremendous number of airborne divisions in the Second World War. They've got paratroopers just funneling forward. So Omar Bradley can comfortably kind of cope with the idea of massive losses. But I mean, I think with Crete was an extremely bloody battle, and like the lesson that Hitler took away from it was, oh my God, never again. We're not doing that again. But obviously, it had a tremendous strategic effect for the British in the Eastern Mediterranean. You know, we lost a key base, and if you look at Churchill's memoirs, there's a sort of a moment of candor where they're trying to, Brooke and Churchill trying to anticipate just how many German airborne forces there are, because Brooke's just expecting Crete to fill up with bombers that are going to destroy the naval bases at Alexandria and make Cairo unusable. So again, it's one of these situations where there's a tremendous effect on the enemy, whereas obviously from your side you just see, you know, the bad aspects, the losses, the cost. I think it's one of those situations. I mean, they were an interesting comparison. If you read Hall's thesis about the development of like close air support, the tactical air forces, Brooke is quite obsessed by dive bombers, and there's a moment where the RAF show Typhoons attacking sort of a range on, I think it's Canvey Island, and he's not interested because it's not a dive bomber, but a Typhoon's far superior to the Stuka, but he's quite obdurate in the discussion, and it's like, well, where's the dive bombers? We need dive bombers, but it's like, no, dive bombers are out of date. This is better, but he's got a bit obsessed by Stukas. That was my reading of it.
Okay. Steve asked a question which I won't put up on the screen because it's in it took up three paragraphs of putting it on the screen. But his question is about the anti-tank weapons, and did the battalions just have 6-pounders and Piats? Because he's heard that bazookas were being issued, and did they have mines as well for the anti-tank defence?
They certainly had mines. I haven't come across any bazookas with 6th Airborne Division, and the parachute battalions didn't have 6-pounder guns. The air landing battalions had a battery of 6-pounder guns, but the parachute regiments didn't. They just had Piats. They were very lightly equipped. I mean, that's kind of my point. I mean, all the points in my presentation are much more explored in the book. But the whole like balance of like 17-pounder anti-tank guns versus Tetrarch tanks, you know, because Tetrarch tank's got a 2-pounder gun on it and a machine gun. Effectively, you know, you could replace it with a Jeep, which is what they do for Arnhem, really, with a machine gun on it.
Helen's asked, was Montgomery one of Gale's instructors at Simla in India in the 1930s?
No, not from my research. Gale was very much I think Gale was, if you like looking for like sort of patronage, which obviously Montgomery, he certainly like looked after the guys he trained. Brooke, I think, was Gale's great patron. If you look at like Gale's sort of career track pamphlets, the war plan. So Gale would have worked with Tiny Ironside, and I think he'd encountered Pownall, but I don't think he'd been trained by Montgomery. He would have obviously encountered Montgomery because he's in the regular army, and I'm sure he'd have met Montgomery when he was in 2 Div under Wavell.
Okay, thank you. Giles was asked what cross-pollination was there of experience and lessons identified, etc., between the 1st and the 6th Airborne Divisions. And he's referring to 1st Airborne Division's operations in North Africa and Sicily and Italy, which did not go brilliantly. 6th Airborne Division's operations in Normandy seemed to go much better.
I think there was cross-pollination. I mean, like some key personalities came out of the Dungeon Party to take up roles with 6th Airborne Division. Norris, the artillery commander, Smallwood Chew, the signals commander, they were all out of the Dungeon Party. So they were effectively out of 1st Airborne Division. Half of the Air Landing Brigade was from 1st Airborne Division, effectively. The Oxen Bucks and the Royal Ulster Rifles. And certainly the problems with Fustian and Ladbroke were studied. And it goes back again to that October 1943 memorandum. And certainly, and I did have a sort of an argument with my supervisor, because I did honestly feel that Gale might have written that memorandum, having interviewed all the people who'd been involved. So they were certainly aware of what was going on. So there was cross-pollination of experience. I think first Airborne Division and 6th Airborne Division were fairly different beasts, actually, once you sort of got down into it, for various reasons. 6th Airborne Division, I think, was very much Gale's baby. You know, he was an airborne guru. He was full of his big personality. Lord Lovat, in his memorandum, commented that he didn't like Gale's loud, hectoring voice. He was a big personality. He picked his own commanders, and 6th Airborne was ready to do Normandy, as was 1st Airborne Division, but not in like the initial assault. So, and I think that, and then obviously 1st Airborne Division had this great frustration of 16 operations cancelled, which was an issue. And I mean, one criticism you can certainly make of Browning is that as Browning kind of like moved up, when he became commander of the British Airborne Corps, he did take a lot of the staff officers out of 1st Airborne Division with him. They all got a lot of promotion. So it left 1st Airborne Division a little bit short, I think, in some key roles. Yeah,
you see that also with Down being sent off to India.
Yeah.
Okay. Neil says, this is perhaps an unfair question, I know, but did you observe in your flowchart at work the accounts of the 2022 Russian airborne disaster at Kiev, Hostomel Airport? Surely, sorry, but it's hard to resist making the link.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I'm not an expert in what happened in 2022 at the airport, but I think with the flowchart, you can certainly see some issues regarding intelligence. I think intelligence. I mean, my understanding is that there were actually Ukrainian paratrooper formations nearby that counterattacked, and obviously there was a whole problem with the Russians' view of how well the Ukrainians were going to fight, I think. So I think there's a massive like intelligence issue, and then like response and reinforcement. And so, yeah, you could use the flowchart. I mean, the flowchart, I'm sure there are a lot of people who don't like the flowchart. They probably think it's a bit sort of self-indulgent, but I found it quite easy. Well, I found it kind of useful to sort of try and get my thinking together, because pamphlet 50 is really interesting, I think. The sort of, because they're expecting sea line to happen at some point, and they've got to be ready for it. And after Crete, it's German airborne forces in the context of them landing in Kent is absolutely terrifying. So, that's such an interesting document. But yeah, I think you could apply the flowchart to that, yeah. Okay,
before we finish, your publishers, Helion, have created a discount code for people, and I've just put it in the chat box. And if you're looking for it on the recording, The code is HAMJAM20, which will give you a 20% discount of both the hardback and the digital versions. So you can purchase both with the discount. Andy, that was a brilliant talk this evening. I really enjoyed it. You obviously put a lot of work into that, and on behalf of the society, I'd like to say that we are extremely grateful.
Thank you very much. Thanks.